Two. Welcome to From the Valley podcast. This is episode 103. This is a special China edition today. My brother Nicholas Wilshire is here to discuss exactly what's sort of happening in China. It's big news, and Nick has been very kind today to be able to, offer his advice and speak about China relations in relation to what's been happening. Other things that we'll probably be discussing is issues with the trade war. So Australia and China, what's actually going on there? What aren't Australia happy about? What's China's angle? Also, sort of more recently, what's been happening with Hong Kong and China, the background to the current protests, and maybe a bit of background as to what was happening last year, which it's a bit of confusion for us Australians, I guess, as to what actually was happening. Nick has been on the ground for 18 years living in China. Most of that time's been living in Shenzhen, which is right next door to Hong Kong. Shenzhen's a large city, very large city. It's pretty much close to the border of Hong Kong. Nick speaks fluent Mandarin and Cantonese. Nick has had many business roles over the last 18 years in China. More recently, he's been the deputy chairman of AustCham, the Greater Bay Area, South China. Nick's strengths are, building business relationships, executive coaching, and recruitment. Nick, welcome along to the podcast.
Thanks. Thank you very much for having me.
That's a good introduction, isn't it? So where do you want to start? I want to start, with the coronavirus. Tell us a bit. I remember going with the coronavirus, Nick, you were sort of fairly alert, sort of late January and in February when it was starting to affect China at that stage. In Australia, we sort of had no idea that this was going to be such a big, pandemic that was going to be a worldwide situation. You sort of made a bit of a prediction back then that this is a lot different to things like SARS and these other types of viruses that have sort of, been around and spread around, but this one really sort of got out there. Tell us about, some of those the early sort of situation in China, how it sort of affected you in the early going.
That's a good question. And I've spent quite a lot of time in Wuhan where the outbreak in China started. And yeah, it's the reason I was so concerned is because when it came about, it was so contagious. It was so contagious and people were literally catching it just by, walking past somebody or shaking hands with somebody or something of that nature. So, and I saw the response in China, and it was extremely, extremely draconian. And I knew that China don't just do things just for the sake of it. And obviously there was a reason for that. So that's what sort of raised initial concerns from my side.
Yeah, so certainly, draconian measures. There are obviously some places around the world have taken a while, but there have been, some countries, won't go into too much detail, that have sort of gone down the draconian measure sort of way of dealing with it, locking out, lockouts and stuff like that for, extended period of time, at least a couple of months in some cases. So it certainly had a huge effect around the world. Talking about China, why is it that they're sort of reluctant, to be involved in the inquiry as to how, coronavirus came about and their responsibility for, this worldwide pandemic?
That's a very, very good question, and I suppose a lot of commentators are asking that same question, and they should. Ironically, they need to sort of come out and be transparent about what's happening. It's a bit of a difficult thing for everybody at the moment because a lot of people fail to take into consideration the trade issues that we're having at the moment between China and the US, which are very, very big, which I'm quite happy to talk about later on in your program. But one of the issues, from my view, as to why the Chinese have been reluctant to inquire, to sort of participate or cooperate at the initial, with respect to the inquiries. But I think now they are getting involved and they are participating. They need to participate as a world power. They need to participate in these sorts of things because it is the benefit for everybody. So it is good that, you know, it has been sorted out behind the scenes, and I think it's positive for everybody.
So I guess, where do you think the coronavirus sort of goes to from here? Is any sort of, what do you sort of, has there been any, I guess in China, for example, has it sort of blown up again at all, and there's been some more infection rates, or has it sort of really died down, or and not sort of affecting things at the moment?
Yeah, well, you've seen, I think from what I can understand, you've seen two outbreaks that have occurred, you know, since the original outbreak. One being on the board in Guangzhou. I think there was a little bit of an outbreak, from what I can understand, in Guangzhou, among a community there. And also as well, on the border of Russia. So there's a province called Heilongjiang province, which borders with Russia. And there's been a lot of Chinese and Russians that have been, you know, going back and forth through that border. And I think it's managed to creep its way back in through that border. And there has been an outbreak. There are draconian measures that the Chinese government are taking now to you know, to stop the virus from outbreaking in that specific area. So, but that's from what I can see. It's, you know, things here in Shenzhen are pretty much getting back to normal. I hosted an event last week with about 50 to 60 people with the Australian Chamber of Commerce. That was very well received, and it was great, and everyone was happy. And, you know, it's getting back to normal here. It's good.
Just probably the final point on the coronavirus. I mean, economically, it's certainly had a you know, obviously a massive impact worldwide. In Australia, I think obviously it's affected us, this part of the world, from that point of view, quite badly for the time being. We don't know how long. It's probably for a long time on end. But are you surprised at all about how well it's been contained in Australia and New Zealand, for example, the coronavirus?
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised at all, because Australia, when it comes to medicine and science, are very much leading the world. They've got some of the best universities, some of the best research centres. So, and if you look at the job that the Chief Medical Officer is doing, he's doing an absolute fantastic job, along with the Australian government and all the premiers and chief ministers. So, you know, it doesn't surprise me that Australia are doing such a great job. I don't know about New Zealand. I would imagine, you know, it would be a similar situation. But no, I think the Australian, you know, majority of the Australian people are doing the right thing, and, you know, making sure that they're participating in social distancing and that sort of stuff. So, you know, it just makes sense that Australia would do well, because they've, you know, like I said, they're very much leading the world in all those different areas.
Okay, moving on to, I guess, Australia and China's relationship. Obviously, you used to live in Brisbane prior to moving to China 18 years ago, so you're obviously you're familiar with Brisbane, and obviously we've sort of had some involvement, I guess, in the Australia-Chinese sort of I guess groups that sort of are around this area of Brisbane. I guess, tell us a bit about the background to where the trade war currently is at, I guess, between Australia and China.
So So obviously you've had the Australian government that have asked for an inquiry into the origins of the virus. And I suppose China took that personally. You know, I think Australia were entitled to ask those questions. And, you know, unfortunately, the Chinese have taken it personally. I suppose they've thrown their toys out of the pram. And they've decided to whack on some pretty heavy tariffs on Australian products. So from what I understand, there's been tariffs that have been put onto barley, Australian barley.
That's right.
And also they've put onto beef as well. Yeah.
So obviously, is that with going forward? How do you think this is going to resolve over time with Australia and Chinese relationships?
Well, I don't think, you know, we can't play the moral card. I don't think that there's a right and a wrong on this. I think, you know, Australia are very right to ask for the inquiry. I think that that's fine, and obviously China have reacted by putting on tariffs. And unfortunately, due to the current situation, I just, I would like to be an optimist with respect to this, because I think it's the right approach. But, in all of my 18 years of experience here in China, I just can't see things getting better. And I would probably make the bold prediction that things are probably going to get worse with respect to, tariffs and trade, before they get better. So, it's a new relationship. China, no one has expected that China would grow to where it's gone to. It's changing the landscape of world trade. And Australia is learning about that relationship. It's learning how to deal with such a player, a major player in the on the international environment, in the international environment. So it's going to take a while before Australia sort of comes to a good conclusion as to how to deal with China. But before they sort of get to that position, there's going to be a little bit more restlessness between the two countries before it gets better. Unfortunately, that's just the irony.
I mean, you've been there for 18 years, so and obviously when you sort of went there, I mean, you sort of, I guess, had the feeling that China was going to become if it hadn't already at that stage, which we don't say it had, but over time it would certainly become a world superpower. That's something you sort of really predicted a bit when you first moved there, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
So so it's not surprising, I guess, as to where they're sitting in the world stage at the moment, as far as the power that they have.
Yeah, it happened very fast. I didn't think that it happened as fast as what it did. I was just from seeing their influence, back 18 years ago, before I stepped on the plane to fly to Beijing. I could see that there was a lot more interest towards China from an Australian perspective, and also from a Chinese perspective towards Australia. I never predicted that it would grow to the size that it has now, where it's sort of, Australia is very reliant on Australian tourism. It's very reliant on Australia is very reliant on China for tourism. Australia is very reliant on China for education, trade, basically all sectors, medical, research, everything. And it's obviously it's a double-edged sword. There's no such thing as a perfect relationship. And as much good that's come out of that, unfortunately there's negative connotation as well. So it is what it is. You just got to work with it and try and set boundaries and parameters to how to manage that relationship, from an Australian perspective. And I think the government, are doing a pretty good job. I think the Morrison government are doing a pretty good job. Obviously, they're not doing a perfect job. No one could do a perfect job. And no, I think it's good, and it's just going to keep getting worse until it gets better. And I think that people don't realise that it's a new relationship. So we just need to be patient. We need to be understanding. We need to be compassionate, and we need to show an understanding of a cultural understanding of both sides.
Okay. Also, I guess what I'd certainly like to sort of find out a bit about exactly what's sort of more recently been happening between Hong Kong and China. I guess tell us a bit about why a bit of background as to why the protests were occurring last year, and what they currently sort of what the current situation is, I guess, between Hong Kong and China.
Yeah, and this is big, and I think that this is going to sort of become the big news very soon in Australian media. So just a quick background. So protests, in 2003, there was a bill, I think along the lines of a national security bill. I don't know the exact name of it, but it was similar to a bill that they've got now that was proposed by the Hong Kong government. that they tried to put through LegCo, but unfortunately, because there were 500,000 people that protested with respect to that bill was basically cancelled and never moved forward. So that's basically the start of when everything happened back in 2003. And that was when I just arrived in China, actually. And then obviously we've seen the outbreak. We've had, I think 2014, we had Occupy Central, where people were trying to get universal suffrage, which universal suffrage basically means the opportunity to be able to elect their own chief executive, or the equivalent of prime minister. So they can elect, the people can have the choice of who they elect. And then, so that was in 2014, and that's when the protesters occupied Central for more than 2 months. And then we had the extradition bill so the Hong Kong government were trying to push forward an extradition bill, which would allow people that have done the wrong thing in mainland China to be extradited back to mainland China from Hong Kong. So if someone was to go from mainland China to Hong Kong and, hypothetically speaking, take a bag of money with them or commit some type of crime on the mainland, then the Hong Kong government would have an extradition treaty with mainland China, and that person would be extradited back. But I suppose, many people were concerned about what that meant, and how that would affect human rights, and whether, there's just a lot of questions around that. And, which, Hong Kong obviously is a very open and free society. And when you have, if this bill was to get passed, then you'd have a lot of people that would be concerned about, how that would affect them and their freedom of speech. And obviously, most recently, so that bill was actually canned as well. So they actually, that because of the protests that happened in last year in 2019, the Hong Kong government decided to basically bin that proposal as well, but which has led to a lot of protests. And I think we've seen in Hong Kong 6 months of pretty intense protests, where we've seen universities that have been taken over by protesters. We've seen people killed. We've seen a lot of violence from both the police and also from the protesters. And I suppose the Chinese government have just had enough. They've just said, no, we don't want to put up with this anymore. There's too many people that are causing problems in Hong Kong. And then, so what they've recently done last week, and this is basically fresh from the press, is that they've decided, so Beijing have actually basically gone over the Hong Kong government and have decided to introduce the national security bill themselves, which hasn't gone through Hong Kong LegCo, and it's something that they're going to be pushing through. And the irony is, and I don't know the details, but I think in the Hong Kong Basic Law, it actually allows for that to happen, for there to be a national security law introduced. But there's a lot of people, like I was saying before, that are worried about their situation in Hong Kong. There's been a lot of people that have been very outspoken towards Beijing and the Hong Kong government and Beijing and the central government. So there's a lot of people that are very worried at the moment, which is very understandable.
How do you think this is going to resolve that those sort of conflicts and protests and that sort of thing? Is there a way you see out, or?
Well, it really depends on the international community, really. I don't really think the international community are going to be able to do a lot, because I think everyone's very sidetracked with the current situation with the virus. So the timing of the way that Beijing have decided to put this forward is be very, very well calculated. I don't think it's just something that they've done. I think there's a lot of rationality behind that from a planning perspective. And, it's a very hard decision because there's a lot of people in Hong Kong that feel very, very strongly about the autonomy that it currently has at the moment, which is very, very understandable. And there's a lot of people in Beijing that feel very, very strongly about, having the opportunity to be able to go and get those people, or go and get those people that are doing the wrong thing from a national security perspective in Hong Kong. So it's a very difficult question. It isn't a simple 2-3 minute answer. It is a very, very complicated answer, and it just needs to be done through dialogue and discussion. But the only problem is it's happened at a very bad time because of the situation at the moment with the virus. So a lot of people that would normally go out and protest about this sort of thing, they're reluctant to, because there are laws that are prohibiting that sort of activity now. So it's a pretty tough situation.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your time, Nicholas. It's been really good. So we haven't got probably too much left as far as time is concerned. But I did want to ask you something. Obviously, being very close to Hong Kong, in Shenzhen, where you're situated. What's the latest with how the borders are sort of opening up between the two countries? Is that what's the current status of that, and when do you see that changing?
So you're talking about the borders between Shenzhen and Hong Kong?
Yeah.
Yep. So the borders opening up between the two cities it's still pretty much closed. Obviously, there's logistics and goods and stuff like that can get sent through where there aren't too much issues. But when it comes to travel, there are still very, very heavy restrictions. So someone like myself can't go through. But from what I understand, that's going to change on the 7th of June.
So I
think that.
So
So I think because at the moment, if I wanted to go to Hong Kong, I can go, but I would get quarantined for 2 weeks. And then if I wanted to come back, I might not be allowed to come back to China because I think once you leave the country, then, you've left because I've got a foreign passport. So, or even alternatively, even if I was to come back, then I would get quarantined for 2 weeks just to come back. So if I wanted to go to Hong Kong shopping, like a lot of people do, the quarantine from both sides is almost a month or a month. So it's not worth just to buy, a new pair of shoes or a suit. Getting quarantined, it's not really worth it. So,
I just thought I just thought I'd ask that one because I just wanted to sort of get an up-to-date picture between the two countries there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, two cities. I wouldn't call them countries at the moment.
Or China.
Not yet.
You know what I mean. Any other final points to add, Nick, at all before we say goodbye?
Yeah, no, I think it's good, and I think the big question that is on everyone's mind here is the relationship with the US and with the Trump administration and who's going to win the election. So I think that's a pretty big concern towards a lot of the people here in China. The relationship, the Trump administration and the Chinese administration is probably at the worst since its formation in 1979. So it's also going to be very interesting to watch how that relationship unfolds as well. And I think that there's a lot of things that are basically telling us that relationship's going to get worse as well. So but I think I suppose we've spoken about a lot of negativity today, but the whole landscape has changed with respect to the coronavirus. And I think it's up to us as individuals and entrepreneurs that we need to navigate through that. If we're able to navigate